Welcome to the Sales Influence Podcast, where we talk about finding the why in how people buy. I'm your host, Victor Antonio. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for lending me your ears. And if you're watching this on video, thank you for lending me the eyeballs. Today, I got Michael Solomon on board, author of the new book called The New Chameleons. Michael, how you doing this morning?
Hey, I'm doing great, Victor. Thanks for having me on.
Again, you should add that word, again. I should tell you this for those of you listening. We recorded it the first time. It was a great interview. And then it wasn't recorded. So we're doing this one more time. So I want to talk about this book, Michael. Like I said, when you reached out and first I was skeptical, and then you sent me the book. I read it, super excited after I was done with it. And I wanted to kick off, if you don't mind, Michael, I wanted to kick off just to kind of frame the conversation. You got two, testimonials on the back cover, on the back jacket. I want to read them because the first one is from Jonah Berger, author of Contagious and The Catalyst. He quotes, "Today's consumers are tough to classify." I love that line already. "There are so many things at once that it often feels like they defy traditional approaches to segmentation. But thankfully, we have Michael Solomon's new book to show us the way." So I thought that was a brilliant one. And then I think I have one here by, let me see if I can find her. It was, I think it's Laura Rise, co-author of The Immutable Laws of Branding and the Fall of Advertisement and the Rise of PR. That's a great title, by the way. She says, "Simple lifestyle categories are gone for good. No consumer wants to be locked into a category cage with a cute label." And then she talks about how great this book is. So I wanted to kind of frame this conversation because that's what this book's about. You're defying a lot of categorizations. Give me the reason why you wrote this book, Michael, and what you want people to take away from the book after they read it.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been teaching marketing for, I hate to say it, about 40 years. And of course, on day one of the first course in marketing, we talk about market segmentation. That's the foundation of what we do, most of us. And, what I came to realize over the last 5 or 10 years, obviously, things are changing. I think everybody has figured that out by now. There's a lot of disruptions going on, some of them bad, some of them good. One of the things that I noticed when I was working with companies, to help them understand their customers, et cetera, is that it's no longer really feasible to carry out the basic logic of market segmentation, because that was a groundbreaking perspective. Actually was invented by your friends at General Motors back in the early days of the automotive industry, and it was based on a recognition that not everybody wants the same stuff, nor can they afford the same stuff. And so General Motors, in contrast to Ford at the time, came up with divisions like Chevrolet, Cadillac, etc. And that worked great for a long time. It certainly worked well when we were in a 3-network broadcast world, in the 60s, where pretty much everybody in the country would be watching one of 3 networks, and we could reach them all pretty well. So you fast forward to today, all of that has been destroyed. We have thousands of channels. Everybody is much more proactive now, largely because of this internet thing, which I guess is here to stay. And, what we're each able to do now is to much more proactively pick and choose from all of the thousands and thousands of options that are out there to create our own lifestyle portrait, and so we're not inventing it entirely. We're still using all of these brands that are out there. The brands are still important, but our relationship as consumers to these brands is no longer the way it used to be. Today, in the old days, these big brands, big popular brands, fill in the blanks, could kind of dictate your lifestyle because, once you bought into that, it was just like deciding whether you're going to watch NBC or ABC. If you're a Nike guy, you're a Nike guy. But today, that's really not the case. And so I decided to write this book because, I'm often asked to give keynotes about changes in consumer behavior. Where are we heading? And I realized that the ways that we often approach our customers, are they male or female? Are they rich or poor? Do they live in the East or the West? And on and on. That doesn't make sense in a world where we can really talk about markets of one, where each of us can actually potentially interact with the brands that we love and we can receive a customized message, a customized product. And as you know, as a sales expert, the greater the degree to which you as a salesperson can approach the interaction from the point of view of your customer, not from your point of view, that's the key to success. So when I talk about chameleons, what I'm saying is that like chameleons, we change our colors, so to speak, very quickly today. That is, we change our identities as we move in and out of different situations, often several times during the course of a day. We're actually not the same person. When you're doing this podcast, you're one person. When you're hanging out with your friends, you're another person, and on and on. And so we really have to, the opportunities, and I talk in the book, I give a number of examples of successful companies that have figured out that the way to succeed is not to offer a slightly better version of what's already there, but rather to kind of look outside of those boxes and say, how can we create a product or service that perhaps combines characteristics of different categories?
Mm-hmm. One of the, and I'm going to highlight this real quick. So 2 things I want to highlight. First is page 13, you talk about the 7 obsolete dichotomies. And you go through these dichotomies. In other words, there's the us versus them, me versus we, offline versus online, producer versus consumer, and you go through the list. And I think that right there was brilliant because it gives you an outline of what the book is about, how the markets have changed. One of the things I like, and if I can just start here, because I thought this was, I had to go back and reread this the second time because we're going to talk the second time. I said, and it's always interesting what you find different the second time. Yeah. And I wanted to kick off this conversation with the example of one of my favorite companies, Lululemon. If we could just start there, because I think that kind of hits the brand customization, personalization. Talk to me about I think Chip Wilson here, who's the founder, he came up with what you called his muse or muses in this case. Talk to me about what he did and how it really applies to people who are thinking about trying to reach a certain market.
Yeah, well, what he did is actually, it's something that's fairly common, and it's really catching on now for people who didn't realize it. What he did very simply was, as he started to put together his new lifestyle yoga brand, he envisioned the typical user of what he was going to sell, and in great detail. So I give the details in the book about this woman. I think her name was Ocean, if I recall. And he basically created what in people in sales will call a persona, perhaps. And what that does is it may not capture everybody, certainly, who walks into a Lululemon store, but it captures his vision of who that ideal customer is, but not in just broad brush strokes like, she's 28 years old. You've got to get into the lifestyle. You've got to get into really spending the day in her shoes and understanding. Well, I guess you don't wear shoes when you do yoga, but really understanding the experience of the brand from the perspective of a heavy user of that brand. And what that does is, creatively, it allows you to really kind of transport yourself into that person's life. And the better you can do that, certainly as a salesperson or as a product designer or a retailer, to the extent that you can develop your offering so that it really resonates with that individual, it's so much more impactful than just saying, well, maybe we'll find some women who want to do yoga.
Right. What I loved about that, when I read this, because he described Ocean, 32 years old, professional single woman, makes $100,000 a year, has engaged, has a condo, traveling, loves traveling, fashionable, has an hour and a half to work out every day. And it said here, this is what I thought was interesting, what you wrote. He said, the ideal user, according to Wilson, appeals to all women. He quotes, I quote him rather, if you're a 20-year-old or you're graduating from a university, you can't wait to be that woman. But if you're 42 years old, with a couple of children, you wish to go back then. And I thought that was a really interesting, look. I mean, can you add some flavor to what was the thought process there?
Yeah, well, we, as I think so much of marketing is what we call aspirational. Everybody's on a project. We're always a work in progress. We're always in beta. And so our motivation to buy products and services, especially those that impact us as individuals, so much of that is governed by the extent to which we see that offering helping us to get to that aspiration. So it's kind of like a bridge from A to B. Here you are now, here's where you want to be. We call that your real self or your ideal self. And so much of advertising is built around this idea that we're going to show you how to get much closer to where you see yourself going. And so, whether you're not there yet or you used to be there and you want to go back to it, as in this example, that persona needs to be a little bit aspirational. It's not necessarily literally the heavy consumer of your brand, but where is that person going? And so we can never lose track of this, that our customers' aspirations are changing. And so, there's the marketing graveyard is full of products that were awesome at the time because the company identified an unmet need. But the reason that it's in the graveyard is that they stopped there. They said, okay, we checked that box. We understand our customer. We don't need to innovate anymore. And then other companies come along and do that innovation and eat your lunch.
Yeah.
So, one example I like to use is the Sony Walkman. Sony in the 80s was brilliant because they came up with this idea that we wanted our music to be mobile. So they invented this Walkman. I guess you could probably see them in museums today, maybe. And they said, okay, we're done. And so today when I ask my students, how many of you own a Walkman? Because they all live to listen to music mobily. How many of you listen to it on a Walkman? 0 hands go up. Mm-hmm. And so other companies like Apple came along and said, yes, but going down the road, there are going to be better ways even to take your music mobily. So Sony identified that unmet need brilliantly. They just dropped the ball after the initial introduction.
I agree. Two key things. One is that I love the example about Lululemon because when he's looking at the people who want to be like that woman or the people who want to go back in time, it's almost looking at like market adjacencies in a persona-like way. So I thought that was interesting. But you said something key, though, that customers, and you used the word progress, because customers are trying to progress towards something. They want to be somebody. They're on a journey to that. And I think understanding that journey is what you're talking about as far as remaining flexible. Is that a fair statement?
It is. We each have multiple journeys because we have different dimensions in our lives, whether it's professional success, personal success, mastering your tennis game, looking good in shorts, whatever your particular goal is. And so we're constantly moving and also we're moving away, right? We want to distance ourselves from types of people that we don't identify with. And we saw that in the political arena. Let's not even go there. But so that motivation is both pulling you and pushing you toward new realities. And the marketer's goal is to be there to give you the stuff you need, which means the marketer has to know in advance what it is you're looking for. And if you're able to come up with an offering like that, I love Peter Drucker, the great management theorist, used to say that the goal of marketing is to make selling superfluous. Another word, and I don't think we'll ever get there, so don't panic, salespeople. You still got a job, but what he meant was that in an ideal world, we would anticipate what people want as they move forward so perfectly that we don't have to sell them at all because it will be obvious to them that this is a product or service that is going to help them get to where they're going. Now, obviously, in the real world, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Michael, but aren't we kind of getting there? When you look at what we're doing with, the customer journey, customer mapping, artificial intelligence, what do you see? Because I think we're getting there. Like where salespeople are now, I don't want to say a secondary thought, but the buyer's further into the buying journey and ready to make a decision.
Well, the buyer's definitely further in by the time for example, certainly by the time they go to a store, either online or offline, they often know what they're going to buy. They're just going there to buy it because their social network has already, given them the information that they need. But you're right. I mean, the goal, when you look at so much of AI in the marketing area is about predicting behavior. And so, you've got, for example, Amazon is working on what they call predictive logistics, where they know that Victor probably in a week or so is going to order, personal care product or something, they already have that product in the warehouse near you because they know that you're likely to order it.
Correct.
And so anticipating that behavior, that you're right, we are getting there. That's a little scary because it means we have no free will. So there always is, by the way, a space for what I would call serendipity, or, for example, one thing you can't get on Amazon that you can get at a bookstore is going down an aisle that you don't normally go down and seeing the titles. Amazon's great at suggesting titles based on what you've already looked at. But that one element that I hope doesn't go away with automation is the notion of surprise, and still being, a salesperson can still suggest a solution that is outside of the things that would normally be predicted. That's where a really creative salesperson comes in.
Yeah, I think what's the guy's name? Kurzweil says we'll reach the point of singularity when the computer can think on its own. I don't think we'll get there, not in our lifetimes. I think the part, as you pointed out, the creative piece, the innovative piece, that's something a machine can't do. And we're making one large assumption, if I may, is that we think using neural networks that we're actually mimicking the brain. But I think the brain is much more complex than a neural network. So it'll be a while before we get there. So you're right. Don't panic. Now, in your book, you talked about, I want to hit a couple of key points here, because you talked about let's start out with the profile of a millionaire and how that box looks a little different than what we think it is. Most people think it's the guy with or the gal with the jewelry, the whole bit, the nice car. Walk me through the new millionaire profile before we really get into this.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a commentary today that, frankly, being a millionaire, it's still a good thing, but it's not like what it used to be. Right. When a house, when a 2-bedroom house costs $1 million, having $1 million isn't so great. I wouldn't turn it down, but yeah. But yeah, obviously, a lot of the images that we have of types of people that we aspire to, where is it coming from? It's coming from the media. And obviously, the media idealizes things, So I've spoken to a lot of people from other countries who tell me when they first arrived in the U.S., they thought that the streets were paved in gold. They thought that everybody drove a fancy car and lived in a mansion, because when they watch the TV shows from, Central Europe, wherever they are, that's the image of America. People are either getting shot or they're wealthy. Now, both of those things are going on, but not to the extent that the media depicts. And so, to your point about a millionaire, a lot of millionaires are more likely to fit the Warren Buffett mold of being, living relatively modest lifestyles, not splurging on these things, having, not getting a new car every year and all that. And so, there's an example where a lot of times in sales and marketing, we market to the customer we want to have rather than the customer we do have. And so, and that's why, by the way, so many marketers go after younger consumers and more affluent consumers, which is great, but they're often missing the boat, because you've got people like this millionaire, let's say, who's not going to be really influenced by a message that paints a picture like you did with the big gaudy jewelry and stuff like that. So the reality is often different than the picture that the media will paint. We have to be very careful about that.
And again, this is what I love about the book, The New Chameleons by Michael Sullivan. You have to get this book, especially if you're in marketing. You got to get this book. You touched on something in the book, and I've never heard this phrase, Michael. I've never heard this phrase, ambicultural. Yeah. And this section really hit me, because I took it personally, because you were talking about Hispanics, and obviously my family's from Puerto Rico, so I took it personally in a good way. But you talked about that the research, and I'll read some of it, research that examines such factors as shopping orientation, the importance of people placed on various product attributes, media preferences, and brand loyalty generally supports this pattern. And the pattern is that, you walk through how we identify with brands as Hispanics. And as I was reading this list, you talk about they have more negative attitude towards business in general. They access more media that's in their native language. I'm like, sure, Telemundo, right? They are more brand loyal. Yeah, we didn't change a lot of brands, Michael, when we were growing up. We're more likely to prefer brands with prestige labels. Oh, you got us pegged on that one. And they're more likely to buy brands that specifically advertise to their ethnic group. I was like, yep. I said, dang, I think Michael's right. And so talk to me about this ambicultural and how we as companies can begin to market to some of these segments more effectively.
Yeah, well, one example of what I was talking about before, kind of, taking a huge group of people and assuming that they're all the same because they have the same label, whether it's female or Hispanic or whatever that label is. Within every one of those big categories, there are gradations there and there are differences. And I'm sure you would agree that not every Hispanic consumer is the same, even though a company might say, well, okay, we have our Hispanic consumers. What are we going to say to them? So, so one of the important ways to differentiate within a category like that is degree of acculturation. In other words, are they first generation? Are they fifth generation? And obviously age within that as well. So younger people who are we're living in a multicultural society, obviously. People are exposed to a lot of different cultural influences. Just go into a food court in a mall and you get to pick all the different ethnic foods and so on. And this idea of ambiculturalism, what that means is just like you could be left and right-handed. I think a lot of younger people who are, let's say they're Hispanic or they're Asian, whatever they happen to be, they're marrying part of their traditional culture with the broader culture that they interact with every day. So to expect your abuela to be the same as you, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so what gets interesting is, for example, when you look at music, you see the crossover categories. And that word crossover is important because it's what I'm talking about in terms of general marketing strategy. You might have traditional, let's say, Latin music, but then you've got crossover music that marries, let's say, rap or hip hop or even rock or I guess even country. And so that's, I think, a more accurate picture of today's chameleon, who is not, they may still think it's very important to understand, let's say, their Hispanic heritage, but that doesn't mean they're going to be lockstep traditional Hispanic like their grandparents are.
I agree.
So there's always this tension between, how much do you assimilate and how much do you retain of your home culture? And in America, that plays out in some really great ways, and it opens new market opportunities, especially for people in other cultures. Again, let's just talk about food. I think that's the most obvious. If we look at ethnic restaurants and all, when I was growing up, we had one Chinese restaurant in the whole city, and we thought we were very cosmopolitan when we went there, but of course today every other restaurant is Chinese or something else, and we take it for granted that we can sample. So really the marketing landscape is a lot more like one of those big international buffets. I don't know if they'll ever come back after COVID, but you know what I mean, where we can sample lots of different cuisines rather than just being locked into one. That's what today's consumer is about, sampling and exploring.
Yeah, I've always been, and by the way, I agree with you, because we grew up listening to like salsa music, but, because I'm first generation, I evolved into, the crossover of hip hop and Spanish music, which is reggaeton, which has some reggae flavor in it. So it's like, we evolved. And I'd love to get your opinion on this because I've always, I shouldn't say always, let's just say for many years now, I've disliked the labels of Hispanic. This is just me being personal here. And Latin. I'm like, what does that mean? I was born and raised here. So when people say, are you Hispanic? I'm going, they always label me Hispanic American. I'm always flipping it for them. I go, no, it's more like American of Hispanic descent. What are your thoughts on these labels that we're getting slapped with and, the marketing that goes along with it?
Yeah, again, that's the heart of my argument here is, what psychologists call it a nominal fallacy. And what that means is that this feeling that we have that if we assign something a name, we understand it. Mm-hmm. So we give it a label like Hispanic American, and then we tick the box and we move on. But again, obviously, there are a lot of nuances there. And Victor, one of them, by the way, my son-in-law is Cuban American from Miami. So I've learned a lot about the more of the nuances of the Hispanic consumer. And so even within that, you've got huge distinctions, obviously, between country of origin, whether it's Puerto Rico or Cuba or Honduras or Mexico, et cetera. People within that category, and my son-in-law is fluent in Spanish, but he can listen to anybody talk on the street in Spanish and tell me what country they're from as well. And so he's making much more fine-grained distinctions. And so if he's doing that just in terms of people speaking, don't you think he's doing it in terms of products as well? It's just obvious to me.
Great point. Yeah, I get people still asking me, do I like spicy food? I'm like, we're from Puerto Rico. We like garlic. We don't like spices. Cubans are the same way. But I want to move on to something you talked about, influencers and what people are looking for in the market. We all know that consumers are inundated with a lot of product content, a lot of product categories. And you used the word curation and category expert. And can you expand on that just a little bit?
Sure. So, to me, one thing that's very ironic is that the biggest, from a marketing perspective, the biggest challenge we face in the developed world today is not that we don't have enough choices, like some people in the world and some people in our own country, obviously. But the biggest challenge we face is having too much choice. The internet in particular, obviously, opened up this fire hose of information that we get drowned in every day. There's no way, and our brains have not evolved fast enough to process all that information. We're each exposed to about 3 times as much information in a day as people were in the 1960s. And that number is growing even more every day. So what we need is, we talk a lot about consumers kind of, taking over, removing the need for salespeople, you were saying. One reason I strongly disagree is that the salesperson's job today is not necessarily to present us with the choices, but to curate the choices and narrow them down. So if you think about it, we live in something that, again, psychologists call hyper choice, which means that we have so many choices that we zone out, and the paradox is we assume that by giving consumers more and more options, we're doing them a favor and they're going to love us. But what the research shows very strongly is that after a certain point, as people get more and more options, like say customizing your car, you have 200 different ways to pick the interior of your car. People actually make poor choices when they have too many options because we're just not able to handle all of that. And so we've always relied on what we might call curators, like a museum curator who picks and chooses. There might be 10,000 Italian Renaissance paintings, but the curator can't show you all of them and doesn't want to. So she's going to pick, the 20 that best exemplify that to put into a museum. And in the same way, a retail buyer is a curator. So if I'm loyal to store X because I always love the clothing that they have there, what I'm basically saying is I am abdicating part of my role to the people who are stocking that store because they obviously are on the same wavelength I am. And so I'm not even going to consider all the other choices. I just can't handle that. And so the biggest challenge today is how do we edit down all of these options? And that's where all these intermediaries in the channel are springing up. You have the traditional ones, like I said, the retail buyers, let's say, or, the editors of Women's Wear Daily or somebody like that. But today we have these so-called influencers who are not necessarily formally trained, don't necessarily work in the industry, but they have one way or another convinced you that they're able to take a look at 10,000 choices and make a recommendation of 10 of them to you. So, whether or not they're qualified to do that, what their motives are, that's a different conversation. But the reason that so many people are looking for these influencers is just to uncomplicate what is a very complicated marketing world.
No, I love that. And by the way, we both agree that the sales role won't go away. I think when you get into, I guess, a situation where it's a complex sale, B2B complex sale, you're always going to need somebody to guide you. And this kind of really ties in, if we can just tie it back to sales a little bit, the trusted advisor role. The trusted advisor role is another way of saying a curator. It's a person who's going to help you make a buying decision. And if I hear you right, and I think I am, is that the customer, to some extent, wants to be guided in the right direction. So in other words, wants advice from a salesperson that's positioned themselves as a trusted advisor. Yeah. Fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, at one point in my career, I did a lot of research on so-called wardrobe consultants, people who pick your clothes for you. And I was fascinated by that because that's an example of a highly personal decision where you would think we would want to have maximum control. And yet what I realized is a lot of people, especially career women, who were very competent in their careers, were paying a total stranger to come in and pick out their clothing for them. And I think that task is actually, when you break it down, very similar, even in a B2B context, to looking to an advisor to narrow things down for very important decisions. And what I found is they have one of two motivations. And I called it the head versus the legs. So the legs means I know what I want. I just don't, I'm so overwhelmed. I need somebody to go out and buy it for me and maybe to get it at a better price. But the people who were the heads, so to speak, really didn't trust their own judgment. And they wanted a professional to come in and make the choices for them. So those are two very different people. So there I am. I'm guilty of what I was writing about. I've already just created two labels, head versus legs.
Oh, I love it.
But the idea is, you're absolutely right that the salesperson is the trusted advisor. But it's also important to know what it is your client needs advising about. In other words, do they want that convenience aspect? So for you to navigate the channel and just make it easier, or do they genuinely want some advice about what they should be looking at in the first place? And a lot of it has to do with how confident they are, how long they've been in that role, and so on. So if your client is as a B2B salesperson, if your client is relatively new to that domain, it's a fair assumption that they don't just want you to navigate the channel. They want some direction from you. And as they get older and more seasoned in that role, that's when they're likely to say, yeah, I get it. I know what all the options, but I need you to go in there and actually negotiate the deal for me.
I love it. I'm kind of smiling inside because you kind of called me out without knowing that you called me out. So I have a reality show. Did you know this, Michael? I have a reality show.
I did not know that, no.
So I have a reality show. It's called Life or Debt. It's on the Paramount channel. We did one season. I was the host, right? It's called Life or Debt. And I didn't know how to dress myself for the show. So I literally spent, almost a whole day with just a personal designer. And I'm not talking about designer clothes. He just had to go, no, you want those jeans to look like that. It's not tapered enough. Okay, the type of shoes, okay, you only wear these. And it's not that I don't know fashion. Come on. Latins know a little bit about fashion. It's just that my head was the problem, Michael. It wasn't my legs. My head, I didn't trust myself. So I relied on somebody else to give me the feedback. I think that's a great analogy, by the way.
And there's so many businesses that are like that, stockbrokers, financial advisors. It doesn't have to be just, consumer products. When you think about something like a stockbroker, do you go full service or not? And if you're going full service, it means that you want that head function, So just about any product or service that you offer to people, it doesn't have to be tangible. It can be managing their money, managing their company's money, real estate, all of these things. That same kind of logic applies.
And I know we talked about this already, but I want to put a finer point on it to make sure people get it. Because when you're highlighting curators and the influencers, these category experts, you're really talking about people get to the point where, one, they don't trust themselves or they don't want to do it, the leg piece. But also there's a lot of decision fatigue going on. I'm tired of making decisions. I just need somebody to just tell me what to do.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Okay, absolutely. And again, we do the opposite as marketers. We say, well, let's give them more choices, and so we call that feature creep sometimes. When you look at all the different features that I was going to say your VCR, but we don't even have those anymore. I'm dating myself, but whatever that device is called today, all of these things. Let's add 10 more features to make it even more convenient. And then we have this decision fatigue that you're talking about, where people throw up their hands and say, you know what, I'm going to flip a coin pretty much. Who cares?
Yeah. In many cases, I mean, depending on which study you believe, your biggest challenge is not your competitor. Your biggest challenge is the status quo. People don't want to do anything because they're so overwhelmed. They go, you know what? I'll do this next year. And so I think to your point, It's like we as salespeople, it should be okay with nudging. I said never push, but it's okay to nudge.
Nudge. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, there's this thing and I think it's the Proteus effect that you talk about. Talk to me about the Proteus effect. I think it's a fascinating concept.
It is. Yeah, the Proteus effect. So Proteus was a shape-changing god. And the reason this is referring to research that's done on virtual worlds, where people are interacting as an avatar, whether it's in a video game or The Sims or and by the way, I mean, a whole other conversation on this, but this is an underground activity that involves millions and millions of people around the world that many marketers have no idea is going on. But what they find there is that, the important thing, the reason I highlighted in the book is that we're spending so much of our time online. Right now it's up to about, for younger people, about almost 11 hours a day looking at a screen.
What?
And that number is rising. Yeah, 11 hours a day. When it was 6 hours a day about 10 years ago, people said, "Oh my God, this civilization's going to end." And then it went up to 8, and now you can see the trajectory. But my point is here that increasingly so much of our identity just stands to reason. If you're spending half of your life in an online situation, a lot of your identity is going to be formed by the experiences you have online. And so in this particular application, what they find is that that our experiences online actually, when we come back offline, change the way we feel about ourselves. It's not an isolated kind of thing. And so, for example, in one study that demonstrated this, they would send guys in, college students in to interact in a virtual world, and this very attractive female avatar would come up to them and start flirting with them and, tell them how handsome they are and all this. And meanwhile, they're just an avatar. They're not the real guy, And then they end the experiment. The person thinks the experiment is over. They leave, and half of them are not exposed to that treatment, right? So then they leave the experiment, and as they're walking away in real life, a very attractive female student comes up and starts to talk to them. And what they find is that the guys who were emboldened by their experience as an avatar in the virtual world were more assertive and more likely to follow up and, try to get a date with the girl, what have you, because their self-confidence, even though they were just this little avatar, that affected the way they felt about themselves. So, it's a fun little study, but the broader point is that we can no longer separate what we do offline versus online. So one of the major dichotomies I talk about in the book that is obsolete is going offline versus going online. Today's young people are constantly moving back and forth, and they never can really tell you if they're online or offline because they're both at the same time. And marketers need to figure that out really fast.
That's, like I said, when I read that, I'd never heard of that. And I think it's fascinating. And immediately my brain rushes to how would you apply that in selling? And much like the example you're giving about the young men being approached by the young lady and getting that positive reinforcement, online, and taking those characteristics offline, I think about training. And I said, what if you could have or reinforce those positive sales experiences online, how that person would feel offline? That'd be interesting, wouldn't it, Michael?
Yeah. And actually, my colleague and I actually did some of that with pharmaceutical sales reps, where we trained them by having them interact in a virtual world, especially when they were just starting out and they were petrified about calling on doctors. And we actually set up a virtual doctor's office at one point and had them practice trying to talk to an avatar doctor rather than a real one. And basically what we found is they were a lot more confident after that experience because it's a more of a risk-free way to do it. You probably remember, I'm sure you've had thousands or millions of sales interactions. You probably remember your first few because you were petrified.
Right. Yeah. Not much came out of my mouth.
Yeah.
It was hard.
And by the way, again, a broader issue probably for another podcast is so many of our sales interactions as we move more and more online are going to be either with avatars or with AI that looks like a chatbot or looks like an avatar. Is there a real person at that call center, et cetera? And that is a major issue. I write and talk about that quite a lot because marketers haven't really figured out, if their salesperson is going to be a robot. Let's say it's in a physical store, and because we're starting to see that in Japan, a bank there has robots waiting on customers in the bank. They haven't given a lot of thought to what should be the characteristics of that robot. Just like we do, you were talking about your clothing on the TV show. These are cues that are very, very important, and yet we're throwing these chatbots out there and not really thinking about, should they be male or female? Should they be lifelike or animated and on and on? And yet we know from 60, 80 years of research that little cues like that, like whether your jeans fit or not, for better or worse, that is a major cue that people are going to use to decide if they like you, if they trust you, if they're going to buy from you.
It's funny how when I was getting dressed by the guy, I was seeking validation. I kind of was self-aware. I was like, why am I here with this guy? Oh, that's right. I'm seeking validation because I don't know what I'm doing. And getting back to your example that the study you did with the virtual salespeople or the salespeople who went virtual. So what did you? Can you give me more on that? On like what happened? This is the one where they were interacting with the chat bot or the virtual assistant, and they came up.
Essentially, we have a strong pharmaceutical marketing program at my university in my business school, and so we train a lot of students to go out and be reps. And usually, that kind of sales training, as you know, is extremely expensive and time consuming because usually they have to literally bring real doctors in or real executives in from pharma companies to role play with the students. And I'm sure you do a lot of role play as training, that's a huge cost. And it's very nerve wracking for the newbies, right? So what we did in this particular application, we created a doctor's office, and the avatar, the student would have to come in dressed as a sales rep, as a detailer, come in. And for example, what we found out in our research was that the biggest sales obstacle in those settings is getting past the office manager. A lot of them call that person the dragon lady, by the way. That seemed to be a common. And so some of our exercises had to do with not just talking to the doctor, but walking up to the desk where this kind of forbidding woman, an avatar woman, is sitting and basically trying to talk their way into the doctor's office. And of course, the gatekeeper's job there is to keep the doctor away from those reps. So by giving them strategies in a very low risk setting, because they knew at some point that this is a simulation, they could leave. What we found was that their training experience was a lot more positive for them, and the professionals that we used who train these salespeople who are part of our faculty were blown away by how different the students were in terms of their confidence. Because often their students, after those initial experiences, they're like just a shell of a person because it's so traumatic for them. You have, let's say a 20-year-old college student who's never done anything like this, who now has to walk in and talk to a doctor. That's pretty scary stuff. So there's lots of, and by the way, these virtual environments, like I said, a topic for another day, but because you're able to simulate very, very realistically a lot of real world experiences, there's a huge amount of applications. So for example, the military uses this technology for PTSD victims to help them relive traumas by taking them to a virtual battlefield where there are shells landing and helicopters flying and all that. So it's being used already in a variety of ways to train people like salespeople who are in a new situation that has a lot of risk attached to it. and that requires them to master certain routines and et cetera. Very interesting stuff.
That is. When you published that paper on the pharmaceutical study that you did, I'd love to read it. Yep. Seriously, I'd love to read it. I wanted to hit on something you talked about. It's P2P Commerce, because I think this is very fascinating. Can you just go into what you meant by that and the examples that were in the book? I think were just great.
Sure. So P2P means person to person. And, again, a dichotomy that's dying is that we have big banks and then we have consumers, and what we find today is that many of us are turning into bankers. So and you find in developing countries like in Africa, for example, when I was there a few years ago, I was amazed that there were no physical banks that I could see. And yet everybody's doing their banking on a cell phone. So they kind of skipped that infrastructure part that we have. And what that means is that it empowers people, like, for example, a rural woman in an African country who is able to now start her own business. Maybe she's doing direct selling like Mary Kay or something. They're very big over there. But what it means is that you and I are able to do a lot of business and eliminate the middleman, which is that bank. And so we have a lot of we have banks now that are really pure plays. In other words, we have banks that do not have physical branches at all. They're only online. And some of those are empowering the consumer to actually carry out the transactions. And, this has been happening for a long time. I mean, for many people, they haven't been in their bank for the last 10 years because they've done everything on their phone. Others like the security of the building. But this is kind of the engine that's driving a lot of the whole gig economy is built on this. And so for salespeople, especially if they work for themselves, this opens up a lot of doors because you don't need to have that capital from the bank. You don't need to have that seal of approval. And it's breaking down a lot of boundaries, a lot of walls.
No, I love that. You also talked about, I don't know if crowdsourcing is going to be the right word here. You had a Lego example and a DeWalt as an example of two companies who were using people, crowdsourcing, to actually get, or wisdom of the crowd, I should say, just to develop new product. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because that, one of the fundamental dichotomies that's breaking down is producers versus buyers versus consumers. And so what you're seeing here is that, and again, so many companies, Apple is the worst offender, but there are many companies who believe it's absolute disaster to give your customers any peek at your product before it's absolutely ready. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, a lot of successful companies have figured out that it should be the opposite. Software developers were probably the first because they would invite users of their code to go in and debug it. When Microsoft does that, they save millions of dollars a year by having legions of coders who are happy to go through and debug their programs. If they had to pay their own people to do that, it would be enormous. So what we're seeing is in a lot of businesses, looking at the customer as a co-creator of the product is a very, very powerful way to go. And incidentally, using salespeople in the same way. Your salespeople are the best source of intelligence about what your new product line should look like. Because they're hearing all the objections of the old one, right?
Let me pause you here, Michael, because every salesperson is going to be paying homage to you right now. Every salesperson is going to be paying homage to you because that's always been the problem, right? That product managers don't listen to frontline salespeople. And a lot of that stuff's not. So I'm glad you said that. Sorry, I had to interrupt because that was such a great point.
No, it's true. And you lock out your employees and you certainly lock out your best customers. They should be they have their ear to the ground more than anyone else. And so the ones you mentioned that I talk about in the book, like Lego and DeWalt, two very different, verticals. What they have in common is that they've basically lifted up the kimono and let, consumers can suggest ideas for new products. They can talk they have a community that they encourage to talk about this stuff. And, Apple has that as well, but it's never officially sanctioned, so you have a lot of people who want to get involved and, here's how I would change the next iPhone, but Apple doesn't want to hear about that,
Yeah.
But many companies do. And so you can call it crowdsourcing. You can call it a lot of different things. I like to call it co-creation. And what it means is that we rethink the role of the salesperson. We rethink the role of the customer to understand that their job title, so to speak, also includes co-creation with the people that traditionally keep themselves locked up until that product launch is ready to go.
Yeah. I just read an article. Elon Musk made a statement that he doesn't care about patents. And his now, at first, when you first hear that, you're kind of shocked by the statement. But then when you hear his reasoning, it goes along with what you're talking about. He says, look, I said, we got a lot of people working on projects. We can spend time trying to do a patent, but what will happen is somebody will just look at the patent and just try to figure out, we just gave a blueprint for what we just did. And what he's essentially saying is, let's not worry about patents. Let's worry about creating something and evolving over time that piece of creation. And I think he's onto something there. What are your thoughts on that? I know it's off the topic here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the patent lawyers may not be too happy about that, but I think it's a recognition that about the fluidity of this whole process. And again, in the old days, we could make a product and maybe tweak it a little bit, but pretty much keep it out there forever, an evergreen product. Today, it's not going to work that way because consumers are demanding change. They're demanding novelty and stimulation. And again, they want to be part of that change. And so when we look, for example, in the fashion area, we see that so many, knockoffs are everywhere. It's very hard to patent a style, right? And yet people are continuing to innovate, the ones that aren't worried about getting knocked off, because they say, well, first of all, it's a compliment to me, maybe, depending how it's represented. But also, I'm going to be moving on from there anyway. And now I can look at what the reactions are in the marketplace and continue to change. And so, as I said before, we're always in beta, both as people, but also as organizations. We have to be in beta or we're going to die because nothing lasts forever.
I love it. We're always in beta. On that note, Michael, any last words? Give one good plug for this book, why people should read this book and who should read this book.
Sure. Well, I think anybody who's interested in marketing, whether professionally or not, I would love to have them read the book. It really addresses a lot of the fundamental disruptions that are going on today. And what's amazing is that so many marketing people are not really thinking about this because and I understand it because they're focusing on the next quarter. But if you don't understand how your customers are changing, then you're not going to be able to keep up with them. So, I don't want to over dramatize it and say it's survival for reasons you should read the book. But yeah, there is some of that because the tried and true stuff that I've been teaching for 40 years no longer works. Today's consumer is a chameleon. They're not just a fossil.
I agree. I think if you're marketing, you're, again, social media marketing, and if you're just a salesperson, I would highly recommend the book, The New Chameleons by Michael Sullivan. And that is it for the Sales Influence Podcast. This is Victor Antonio, always reminding you that marketing ain't hard when you hang out with Michael and you know how. Take care.